MSCHE 2.0, writing the self-study report and preparing for the evaluation visit. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of some of the housekeeping items. As you can see, this is our disclaimer that you've seen before. Basically, what that means is that you need our permission to use any of this material. Also, we have a couple of ASL interpreters available, and if you need them, please pin them on your screen. Next slide, please. Next slide. My name is Krishna, and I'm one of the vice presidents of institutional field relations at Middle States. With me is my colleague, Dr. Paul Starkey, also vice president of institutional field relations at Middle States. Next slide. We also have 3 co-facilitators that will share their experience having gone through this process just recently. They'll share their insight and their experience that can be very valuable to you. So I'm looking forward to speaking to them and interacting with them. First person is Dr. Amy Rogers, Associate Provost for Assessment and Accreditation at Lycoming College. Then we have Mr. Javier Zavala Quinones, Director for Institutional Research in University of Puerto Rico. And finally, Dr. Lisa Peel, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs at Delaware Technical Community College. Next slide, please. So let's look at some of the workshop learning objectives. This part is sort of the second part of your overall cycle. So in this part, you identify strategies for transitioning from research writing to actual self-study report. Also, you learn the expectations for converting multiple group reports into a single cohesive document, which can be very challenging at times. Then identify keys to success in planning and managing an effective self-study evaluation visit. Ascertain the expectations for the institutional response, especially if the team issues recommendations or finds non-compliance. And then finally, identify strategies for successfully uploading material before and after the visit. We won't cover too much on that because there's a special webinar on evidence inventory and uploading materials. So we'll quickly go over it, but you can find details in the next webinar when that's offered. Next slide, please. There's a Q&A feature, so anytime you have any questions, please feel free to write those in the Q&A feature, and we'll try our best to answer them as quickly as possible. So let's talk about phases of preparing the report. Now, this is really after it's all said and done in terms of your design and you're ready to move forward. And so we'll talk about some of those phases when you're preparing the report. Next slide, please. Some of the key questions that you should ask yourselves while you're looking at this is, what are effective approaches to editing work group report into an effective self-study report? Again, combining all the working group reports and making it a smooth document into one final report. What more can be done now to ensure that the visit is an effective part of the evaluation process and a positive experience for both the institution as well as the team? What happens after the team leaves? Oftentimes, institutions think that their work is done. The team has made its recommendations, but there are several steps after that before the commission renders its final decision. So we'll talk a little bit about that. What is the best way to approach the institutional response, which is very important, and we'll talk about that. Next slide, please. So overview of phases in preparing the report. The first one is planning and preparing. Second one is doing the actual research, then writing the report, and then refining the report until it's finalized. So let's look at phase one, planning and preparing. It starts with when you attend the Self-Study Institute in fall. And after you attend the Self-Study Institute, you go back to your campus and you start organizing and start talking to different people, different stakeholders. So at that point, the steering committee is formulated and it starts writing the self-study design. That happens in spring. And then the Vice President Liaison conducts a self-study preparation visit to your campus and subsequently accepts the self-study design. So that was the first phase. The second phase is doing the research itself. Once the design is accepted, now the real work starts, where working groups do their research based on their lines of inquiry and the research questions that are outlined in the design. Working groups complete their report and then move on to phase 3, which is writing the report. Self-study report is drafted in second spring. And then it's reviewed by all of the different stakeholders in the college community in summer or early fall. And then the team chair, once they're appointed, will be in ongoing conversation with you. And as soon as you're done with your first draft, you will send that to the team chair for review and for feedback. Then comes the fourth phase, which is actually refining the report, incorporating all of the different feedback and input from different constituents and revising the document after the chair's feedback as well. After that's done, the team accesses the self-study report as they get closer to the visit. And the institution is responsible for organizing the evidence inventory to provide evidence for assertions and content that's present in the self-study document. And that process is quite involved, so we'll talk a little bit about that. So writing and revisiting the report. Basically converting multiple group reports into a single cohesive document. Remember, you're telling your institutional story at this point through the lens of your own mission. So it has to have one voice, and it has to be holistic, and it has to be backed by evidence, which is in the evidence inventory. So it's storytelling, but backed by solid evidence. Some of the things that working groups should do while they're reporting are important for the final document. If there's consistency throughout the working group's document, then that makes everything easier in terms of compiling the final report. So consistent in style and format and structure, as I mentioned, written in one voice, accurate as of date of submission, and then rewriting paragraphs and sections that may need revisiting. So again, editing draft for accuracy, consistency, and continuity. So then from group reports to the actual self-study report is a long and cumbersome process, but it's a very important process that institutions undertake. So I'd like to bring our co-facilitators in now so they can share their experience with you, since they've gone through this process recently, and they can give you some good advice regarding some of these questions. As I mentioned before, our presenters are Dr. Amy Rogers, Dr. Javier Cunanas, and Dr. Lisa Peel. So I'll start with Dr. Amy Rogers and ask her the questions that were outlined in the previous slide. Paul, can you go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So Dr. Rogers, tell us a little bit about how often did you ask for the interim reports? And did you have an editorial style or guide that you used? And then most importantly, how did you assure a single voice for the final document?
Hi, all. So I'm Amy Rogers. I'm serving as the Associate Provost for Assessment at Lycoming College in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. We are solely an undergraduate institution, and we only have one campus location. So it was a little easier in terms of bringing more together from a small school perspective. Trust me, every box still had to be checked, even though we're not to check boxes, but you still, as you go down through, everything was still there, just not at the bigger status that many of you may have gone through. When I think about the interim reports, I'm have to ask for clarification there with that. Do you mean in terms from you all or from our working groups?
I believe this is about the working groups.
So, okay, from a working group. So what we did is we divided all of our working groups up, and each of the working groups, we made sure there was someone from the steering committee on each of the working groups who could come back to our steering committee meetings. But we also made sure that that steering committee member was not the sole chair, so that we had many voices of everybody in the working group, not just from the steering committee's perspective. So they a lot of times served as a co-chair. So as they were going through, myself and Eileen Peluso, who was the other co-chair of our self-study, we would go to the groups. If there was a time they met that we could go with them, we would go and be there with them. And we also sent an outline out right from the start. The biggest thing was sending the outline of what we were looking for, how we divided up in our chapters into standards, and then within each chapter, how we aligned it to the requirements of affiliation, and then looking at the criterion under each, so that when they met, the groups met, they had a skeletal outline to follow in the first place. And then they would send us reports or send us questions. And the biggest thing when we talk about the evidence inventory was working with them in terms of what to select to put there. And I'll talk about that separately. But in terms of that editorial or style guide, yes, we did. We took an outline of it. We had it. We talked about getting it to the one voice. But at that point, we were like, we took it. Our provost suggested that he reached out to an English professor and either offered them a stipend position or a course reduction to take all of the working groups reports and put them into one report then. So that's how we got it into one single voice. But our biggest part with the one single voice was to make sure that it didn't change the meaning or what the group was trying to represent. And that's so easy to do if he or she may have felt that, oh, we need to change this, that Eileen and I would have to go back through and be like, that's not exactly by changing that little bit right there, change that whole meaning of this section. And sticking to the page limit actually wasn't an issue with us. Eileen was a math professor at one time. She was very succinct in what she wanted, and she would change a lot of the red tape was drawn out right away. But I think the biggest part was having the outline ready to follow within each working group and just having that open line of communication going back and forth with them, SharePoint sites, so we would go through and look at it from there.
Thank you, Amy. You make a really good, important point about having a conduit to from the working groups to the steering committee.
Yes.
So there's ongoing communication going on. I think that's really important.
Yep, taking somebody from our steering committee and making sure that they were on a working group, but not necessarily the chair of that working group,
Yes.
so that the working group felt their voice was coming through, but then we didn't have to take them out of extra meetings, classes, work, whatever it may be, because it would be somebody from the steering committee coming back to our steering committee meetings to report back to each of us, or to report to the steering committee.
Sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're
welcome.
Let's go to Javier. Let's see what kind of approach you use.
Well, hi to everyone. I'm Javier Zavala from the University of Puerto Rico at Bayamón. I also work with the University of Puerto Rico Central Administration as data coordinator. And our experience working with, interim reports, we decide from the beginning, from our design, that we're going to work with 3 reports in the schedule, okay? But one of the things that, as you may know, the Puerto Rico main speaking language is Spanish. So we have another challenge. we have to decide first if the teams are going to write the report in Spanish or English directly. So at the beginning, that was, a good discussion with all our members of the teams. But we decide that some teams are going to work from the beginning in Spanish and others decide to work in English. So what we have done is that we decide to have 2 professors from the English department. One is going to work with all that is the translation of the documents of those committees that decide to work the document in Spanish. And the other professor is going to work with the editing of the document. So we only have one voice, okay? So, it's more difficult for us, but we have to, to accomplish with a standard of affiliation number 4 that says that every communication that we have with the Middle State Commission has to be in English. Mm-hmm. So that was, very important to us. So that professor that was working with the editing process helped us a lot, to have a single voice, but also we have a style guide document because we developed a rubric for each of the working groups. So they have very specific everything that we have to address in each of our chapters. And each committee is very clear and what we're expecting from them from the beginning. So when we receive the reports, we use our rubric to verify that everything, was addressing and in the reports that they give it to us. We have in each of our committees, we have a member of the steering committee. So that helps, to have the information and the information, get very easy to the steering committee. And for us, the page limit, it was not a big deal, but at the beginning, we said to everyone that each chapter have to be about 15 pages. We know that maybe in some themes that not be possible, like assessment, for example. Mm-hmm. So at the end, in the editing process, we decide, to cut information that maybe is redundant, or we decide, that some graphics or tables can be, appendix, and we, manage, to work with the page limits. That was our experience.
Thank you, Javier, for your feedback. I really like your idea of rubrics to make sure you're double checking everything. And, you had an added element of translation. So, but sounds like you had pretty good strategies to overcome that. Thank you. Next, I'll go to Dr. Lisa Peel from Delaware Technical College, Community College. Lisa?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me to share my experience. This was the first time that I had been deeply involved in a Middle States reaccreditation. And to add fun to our visit, we are a multi-campus institution with 4 locations across the state, and we shifted this time to a single accreditation rather than 4 reports. So the added layer of doing a virtual visit and doing this during a pandemic, we were also taking a great deal of effort and putting it into making sure that we really were bringing together 4 locations that had never written, they'd all written individual reports before into one. And so there was a lot of thought given in, I would say, into some of these steps to make sure that we were writing from a single voice. And also that we were managing just the logistics, the volume of the size of the committee. The steering committee had representatives representing each standard. Some had co-leads depending on the standard. And so that committee then led the working groups. And so when you ask about the interim reports, we didn't use a rubric per se, like Javier had mentioned, but we did use a graphic sort of organizer so that everyone was touching on the points to make sure. So similar to that, but a checklist. And I would say we started with some interim reports with looser deadlines, and then we really adjusted that based on the group's level of need, because research is different for every discipline. And so when you get groups together, you might be able to explain the lines of inquiry, but what we found was the approach to research was very different in the ways that they dug in. And so some of the discussion, I would think the bulk of our discussion actually was refining what we meant for the purpose of the research for the middle state self-study, and not the type of research that someone might do in their particular field or that they're used to for, you know, on their academic research for their area of specialty, for instance. So making that distinction, depending on how familiar the groups were, sometimes involved more check-ins to get to the right point, and to Amy's point as well, to maintain that voice and make sure that we were honoring the research that was happening, but to find a way to present it in a manner that was really going to help us move the self-study process forward. We
Thank you.
certainly, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that your institution or your operations seem a little more complex, so probably having one voice was much more difficult for you.
Yes, so I've heard from both of the previous panelists some of the strategies we've used. So we did have an editorial and style guide to include down to the detail of a list of names of every place on our campuses that we would reference, the official names of anybody that would be referenced on our, board of trustees, for instance, official titles, punctuation, capitalization, all of those things were written into that style guide. And those were agreed upon by two members, well, by the entire steering committee, but the writing of that original guide was written by two members of the steering committee, one who was an English faculty, who's now a director of our communication and planning, and another who came from the marketing team. So, sometimes English faculty and marketing perspectives of how we use grammar and mechanics are a little different. And so then the group could reach consensus around what we were going to do. That was from the beginning. And then those two, along with our chair, were responsible for editing to a single voice. And as far as the page limit, I would echo Javier's comments. We started with a suggested page limit based on what we knew, but with a buffer. And then we wanted to allow for everybody's input and research. We didn't want someone to make a cut of something that would have been really important information in those initial drafts. And then what we did was not so much cut the information, but decide which standard or chapter it fit into best. So, the redundancy really was a matter of negotiating with the steering committee. Where does this best meet the standard or address this criteria?
Thank you. And thank God for those English professors.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll move forward now and talk about some of the tips for revisiting and editing your document. So one thing you want to do is you want to refer back to the self-study design, because that's where you laid out your methodology and how you're going to do things. So it has to stay consistent with how you started out. Eliminate jargon and trite phrases. Try to keep it nice and tight. Eliminate redundancies, which could be really problematic when you have 5 or 6 different reports and they're investigating oftentimes similar things. So smoothing that over and eliminating redundancies is really, really important. And then seeking opinions of diverse campus community members to make your document even stronger, and reading the perspective of an outsider. So giving it to a third party to look at it and get some feedback is really important. Oftentimes institutions also internally appoint somebody as sort of the devil's advocate, who pokes holes in both the narrative as well as the evidence to make sure that all of the questions are answered, and if there are any gaps, those gaps are addressed. And then, avoid the passive voice is really important. Next slide. Another strategy could be that you can have editorial liaison per work group, which I think Lisa and Amy had alluded to, and that can be helpful. And then, making sure, smarter details that you had outlined in the design are there in terms of style and size, margins, headings, citations, and so on. And it always helps to read the document out loud to a group, and that can really increase more feedback and its validity and its conciseness. So some of the questions to ask when revising. Does the report address the articulated priorities and outcomes for the self-study? Because really it's all about your outcomes and your priorities from this document. It honestly represents the institution, and it avoids individual agendas of individual stakeholders. It provides ample evidence for the assessment made, assertion made, and that means that, again, the evidence inventory becomes really important. Yes, you're telling a holistic story through the lens of your own mission in one voice, but then you have to back it up with good evidence. So that's why evidence inventory becomes quite important. And then provide ample evidence to show compliance with middle states policies, procedures, and guidelines, and also federal regulatory requirements. So there are, policies to worry about, there are procedures and guidelines to worry about, federal regulatory authority, and then requirements of affiliation, as well as the standards standards for middle states. Some of the other questions, do you need more evidence to support your points? Is your evidence convincing? Does the report conform to the outlines proposed in the self-study design? So connecting it to self-study design becomes very important. Are the future plans of the institution cited in the self-study, are they realistic? Does the report read as a unified document? Again, the one voice issue comes in. Does the report identify opportunities for improvement and innovation? So as you know, this is not about compliance. This is not only about compliance, but also about improvement and innovation. And so providing the feedback, not only by the campus constituents, but then subsequently by the team becomes really important. And then anticipating the questions on the on-site evaluation team, because when the team comes, they may ask questions that you may or may not anticipate. So being ready for them as much as possible is really important. More specifically, this is an important point. Does the report tell or prove? Is it descriptive or analytical? And definitely make sure that it's not about your future plans, but it's doing what you or analyzing what you've done, and then recognizing gaps and then planning for the future. But just don't continue to say that you're going to do that and it may not come to fruition. So really use your evidence as much as possible for these issues. In terms of sharing the self-study report, the view of the self-study report is crucial by the working groups, because it's their product and they're the ones who researched it, by campus community, and that includes your alumni, students, staff, all the important stakeholders and their feedback and final consensus, including the board of directors, and by the team chair to get it ready for the team. In terms of bringing closure to the writing, at some point you have to stop writing and finalize the document. So communicating the institution's constituents, thanking those who contribute to this process. This was a 2.5-year long process, and a lot of hard work went into it, and a lot of people made sacrifices. So it's important to thank them. And then, reflecting the accomplishments and the learning, assessing this self-study process and advocating the findings. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Starkey, and he'll do the rest.
Thank you, Kushner. I appreciate that. So Kush had reflected a little earlier about the importance of the evidence inventory. So we're only going to touch on that just a little bit. Every year we have a workshop on the evidence inventory, how to curate that evidence. So we're just going to make some kind of broad suggestions here, but I also want to share some information that our co-facilitators had, because they just built their evidence inventories. So they were very successful. All three of these institutions did a really nice job. Okay. So our colleagues are going to do a workshop on how to upload the evidence inventory. So some of you who've been around for quite a while may remember that the evidence came in hard copies or it came on thumb drives. So we need to keep consistent evidence so that as you go all the way through the process of peer evaluation, from the team to the committee to the whole commission, that everything stays the same. And we know that we can't use websites. You're only allowed 5 URLs because the moment the team leaves, somebody changes a website, and so the committee doesn't have the same thing. So when you're uploading this, and we'll take you through another workshop that gives you very explicit directions. Always hit save. You remember what your professors told you. Hit save frequently, and only hit submit once. Okay. So resources, we have some technical or support folks, support at MSCHE.org can help you navigate that the portal, because it is a little bit different. Your VP Liaison is always a good one to go to. Now, Kush is a heck of a lot smarter than I am. So a lot of times I get questions that I have no idea, and I'll go to Kush or one of our other colleagues. On logistics, our colleague Carmela Smith, and then of course you have some of the portal training videos that are useful for you. So make sure that your evidence inventory, when references to the evidence inventory are made in self-study report, that they're clearly communicated in the report itself. Okay, so you don't want to frustrate your team. You want to make it easy for them to be able to say, okay, they're saying this in chapter 1, and here's the documentation for it. So if possible, annotate anything that may have your own institution's language, jargon. My former institution, we had, for onboarding new employees, we had a 4-page document of acronyms and abbreviations. So everybody talked about that in that language on campus. So your visitors are not from your campus. They are laypersons. So you want to make sure that it's very clear and, if possible, annotate it. Do the document titles very clearly identify the nature of the document. So, and I'm going to ask Amy to speak to this. How did you do your naming convention so that you were consistent across the different working groups? And right to privacy. This is huge. You cannot have personally identifying information in any of your documents, And Javier talked about communicating in English. That's one of our requirements of affiliation. And so you must have the evidence. The self-study report and the supporting evidence has to be in English. You are allowed just 5 hyperlinks, and those are the things that are going to be probably your, perhaps an employee manual, your catalog, just think about those things that are going to be cited often, ubiquitously throughout your self-study. Okay? And then cite the document by using parenthetical notations. So, Amy, if you don't mind, I kind of compressed some of the information that you shared with us. You felt like y'all had a pretty good approach to building the evidence inventory. So would you share some of those tips and pointers?
Yep. And as Paul stated, right from the start, figure out your naming convention. It just makes it so much easier to go through with all of your working groups. So for example, our chapters were by standards. So we did standard 1, criterion 1. And then you're going to see me in a few slides. I'm going to talk about our tracking our evidence inventory, how we made a spreadsheet up to track it so that when we were reviewing it, we could go and put a little check mark to make sure beside each one before we uploaded it. And you'll see that here in a second. But my first advice would be that exactly, decide how you're going to name your evidence inventory and where you're going to put that evidence inventory, or you're going to collect it from your working groups as they come through. So we decided that we would create a SharePoint site or a repository or whatever you need to at your institution, where each working group had a place in addition to where their working group would place their materials. They also put their evidence inventory into that. And we, as in Eileen and I, we were the ones who uploaded it. We took that time at the end just to make sure it has to be uploaded 6 weeks ahead of time. We just wanted to make sure that we were the ones that every single piece that got uploaded, we uploaded it. We know it was time consuming, but we also knew it was going to be where we wanted it to be under each standard, each criteria, each requirement of affiliation. When we name the documents, explain and demonstrate, I think one of the things, if we did it in retrospect, I would have, pros and cons. Pro is that we knew exactly what was being uploaded. We knew exactly that it was what we needed to be in the right place. The con was that it did take so much time to do so. But by giving those directions, I still don't think I would allow anyone else besides just 1 or 2 people to have their hands on that final uploading of all the materials to the site. It just makes, too many hands in a cookie jar. It made it more controllable for us in terms of that. But we just made our relevant pages. The other big thing was if they said, oh, well, that's in the faculty handbook under, I would say, go to the faculty handbook, snap that picture of it, put it into a PDF, name it specifically academic policy, standard 2, criterion 3, whatever the name of it was, specifically the Middle States requirement of affiliation 6, a Middle States statement, so that each single piece had the name that would go at the right place to be uploaded. Can we go to the next slide? And then be explicit. Like we said, we went to the working groups. I would go, we divided it up. Eileen and I would just keep going to them. We made sure that she and I both went to every working groups meeting at least once or twice, but we would go to different ones so that we saw every one of the working groups. So we would require them to upload everything into the SharePoint site, which we also had access to. And the big part was about the faculty handbook, like not saying, because of the page limit and how much you can upload and stuff. We just want to make sure that it wasn't too much. I want to make it also as friendly, user-friendly to your reviewers as well. If you say you're looking for the policy on attendance, whatever it may be, then go to that and show them exactly what it is so that it supports. Everything is about supporting what you're saying you're going to do with it. And then what we did, we created what we called our evidence inventory, a tracker. It was just that, how do we track it? We just had this spreadsheet that as something was uploaded to the working group site, and as we were reading the chapters, the information would be there. We worked really well together. The information would be in there. I would take the evidence inventory tracker and I would go through and make sure if on page 72 in the document, it said that they were looking at standard 6 requirement of affiliations 3, and it said that at the end of the parenthetical citation to it, that's exactly what it said in this. That's where it was in the SharePoint to be uploaded as well. So we made sure that we were the ones, we tracked it just in that Excel spreadsheet. We both had the Excel spreadsheet, but I would look at the Excel spreadsheet and she would look at our evidence inventory through the Middle States site to make sure before we submitted anything to Middle States that they matched each other as we went through it. And then, I'm sorry. No, go ahead.
I'm hoping that one of the co-facilitators can answer this question that's in the Q&A. I think it's an important one. How could we institutionally balance between the quantitative and qualitative evidence in the final report? If you have an experience to share, that would be great.
Lisa, do you want to address that?
Sure. I think one of the references you made earlier, Krishna, was about thinking about description, right? Don't tell, but show proof. So I think there's some descriptive data, which I would think is really your qualitative. And then you're going to use all of the evidence as proof, right, to support what you're describing is happening at your institution. And that's where the quantitative comes in. At least that's my interpretation of the flow of the final document.
Yes, I think that's correct. You're right on spot. It's, again, storytelling, but then specific evidence for each criteria and each standard and each requirement for affiliation. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, I would just say that exactly what you're saying there with the Lisa saying with the storytelling piece of it. That's what it is. If you're talking about it and you're saying we do it through this, then you're writing, the qualitative, you're writing the story of it. The one voice comes through those lovely English professors or whoever they get to do so. But the working group is telling the story of their materials. That evidence, make it as user friendly as possible. Just make your PDFs, figure out how you're going to make your PDFs. But the biggest thing is just having some kind of a checklist that you can track it as you go. To me, that was the best part. Is we had this evidence inventory tracker. It was just an Excel spreadsheet. We put the standards of criteria across the top. Or we put the standards, we put the requirements of affiliation, and then we would go down across and list all the documents. And as I would read it, or as we would read our self-study, we would make sure that that's exactly, and I opened every one of those links to make sure that something didn't get uploaded to the wrong place. So when I say double and triple check it, that's what we were doing. We read it, we double checked it, then we went back and we triple checked it. So my other word of advice with that is, it seems like the process goes over 2 years slow, but it really goes so fast. If you do backward planning of it, knowing how far you have to send it out, knowing that this is where I'm at, it does go fast. So give yourself the time, just that good last 2 weeks before the 6 weeks of submitting it, that you can just upload all the documents in 2 to 3 hours a day or whatever it takes, but making sure that good internet connection and uploading all the documents and locking yourself in a room or your office or whatever, saying please, because you have to be so on while you're doing it.
So I wanted to reiterate some things that Amy said. Firm rule: never surprise the president and never frustrate an evaluation team. So make it easy for your team to be able to find concise, descriptive documents. But don't do a data dump. Don't just put everything out there just in case. You want just what's going to really tell your story. Every team is going to ask for additional information. They do. They're going to say, all right, you're telling your story. Can you help me establish a trend on this? And so they're going to ask for additional information, and we'll show you how to upload that additional information when it comes. Amy, thank you so much.
And to speak to that, and that's exactly right. And they had said that they were glad that we didn't add too much. They said, because what you don't have, you're going to give us, and we just put that, we went back to our evidence tracker and we listed that as an addendum piece or as additional information. And then we just double checked it that way again. So think of your naming convention, think of how you're going to double check it, triple check it as you go across. And don't just dump everything in. Tell the story, but use that, as Lisa said, to support your evidence to support.
So some of you that some of the schools who are represented in our audience today have heard me talk about curating the evidence. And I use the example of, one of my favorite art museums is the Philadelphia Fine Art Museum. They have dozens and dozens of Monets in there, but they only put about 12 on display at any given time, because it's the best way to tell the story of that. So you want to do the same thing. What's going to best tell your story succinctly, to the point, and move from there? Right? Amy, thank you so much. That was great. So let's shift gears and talk about some of the other things. Kush told us at the beginning that we wanted to kind of get you ready for some of the visits. There are a whole host of visits that come with this. Last year, your VP Liaison did or maybe this fall, did the self-study preparation visit, where we would review your self-study design document, ask questions, ask for clarification. And next is going to come the appointment of your team chair. So this probably happened or will happen this winter if you're having a spring visit. And your team chair is going to come in. This is crucial. They are going to want to talk about logistics. They're going to want to talk about their different things in the self-study report. They're going to offer you constructive criticism, but they are not yet evaluating. They're just saying, here's what we want to make sure that we have in place. So the chair, every chief executive officer has the opportunity to veto the chair. We ask them to don't get too specific, but we will provide a couple of names to your chief executive officer. And if they're okay with that person, we will ask the chair. So the commission staff and your team will, the institution will send information about the institution to the team chair. And he or she will contact the institution's president and make plans for the preliminary team chair visit. So those preliminary visits for spring team visits, those preliminary team chair visits are occurring this fall. We are going back to face-to-face. We'll talk a little bit about virtual, but we do hope that if things work well, that we will have face-to-face preliminary team chair visits this fall and face-to-face evaluation team visits in the spring. So we will offer a roster of potential team members. Typically, it's about 7 folks. Something that's a little different now is that we also have a vice chair. This is somebody who's a very experienced peer evaluator and aids the chair. You'll get a chance, your CEO will get a chance to look at that list and assure that there are no conflicts of interest among the members of the team. It's really important, and I'm going to ask Lisa to speak to this. We have a policy about additional locations and branch campuses. If you have additional locations, or if you have every branch campus must be visited, but additional locations, the team chair and the steering committee or the co-chairs, they are going to say, okay, which one is going to be best? All right. We try to be mindful of expense. We try not to send folks to the additional location in Beijing if we can efficiently handle it here. The team chair will come for a visit about 3 months in advance and develop the agenda. All right. So this is what we're going to want to do when the whole team comes here. 2 months before the visit, the team chair and the vice chair will talk about assigning different chapters to the various team members. Clearly, somebody with a financial expertise is probably going to get the chapter on Standard 6. So they will make those assignments. Then 6 weeks before, and this is a drop dead deadline. If you set your team date, your team evaluation date, you back it up and you make sure that everything is uploaded at least 6 weeks in advance. Now, you and the team chair, or the president and the team chair, are going to set a mutually agreeable evaluation date. But once it's locked in, you can't change it, because every invitation to a team member is predicated on that date. That's the first question they ask. Are you available on that day? In 2 to 6 weeks before the visit, the team is going to start reading their chapters. They're going to read the whole report. They're going to go through the evidence inventory, and they are going to write a draft report. So how do you prepare for this? Review the guide in the self-study guide, module 7. It has information about the preliminary team chairs report or visit, how the team is built, what are some of the things that are going to be, what are some of the questions that they're going to ask, and just simple things like, okay, does anybody have dietary restrictions on this team? Are there particular requests that they may have? So make sure that you have some members of the evaluation team to visit the branch campuses and the additional locations, and prepare your governing board. Because Standard 7, where we're talking about the governing board, more and more and more, the question that is asked is, how does the governing board evaluate itself, right? How do you do succession planning for senior leadership and for the governing board? So make sure that your governing board is cognizant, knows what to expect when that team comes. As I mentioned, you've got to have branch campuses and additional locations business. If you have 3 or more additional locations, at least a third of them. And this is collaborative between the team chair, institutional representative, and it can be done in advance. So and it doesn't have to be the whole team that goes to these branch campuses and additional locations. The team chair and the vice chair will determine who should visit based on perhaps a particular specialty at a location. And there is plenty of information in the self-study guide. Those of you who went through SSI last year, you heard many of the VPs say, boy, this is a really good piece. Make sure everybody's familiar with it, knows what to expect. So how do you manage an effective team visit? Logistics, logistics, logistics. Because think about it, you're arranging for 7 or so people to come from very different areas, and they, in a very short period of time, a Sunday afternoon through a Wednesday morning, have a ton of work to do. So you want to make it as easy as possible. Make sure that you have contact information, make sure that they have an emergency person. And by the way, I saw one of the questions in the Q&A a little while ago about, will you get these slides? You're going to get a recording of this presentation today. So which will include the slides. You can replay it as many times as you want. So questions for our facilitators. And the first one is specific to Lisa because Lycoming and Bayamon did not have additional locations to visit. So Lisa, how did y'all go about picking those? And how did I know it's virtual at that time, but how did y'all handle the visit to the additional locations?
So ironically, when we started to plan and we were in the beginning phase of preparing for our initial visit from our chair, we didn't know what we were going to have. We were preparing 2 options for both an in-person and for a virtual visit. And then we found out kind of between the time that we were setting up that date and schedule and the next, that actual meeting when our person came to our site, came to the virtual visit. So I will say, one of the things that we did was we started with what made the most sense to highlight as far as flagship programs, if there's any specialized programs that you think somebody would want to see. And those for this time around were scheduled outside of the visit. They happened beforehand so that we could really get the most, and that team could dive into our all the documents and the report and have a good discussion. And so they actually came a few weeks before, I think, to our aviation program virtually. And we had, some senior leadership there and also the representatives of faculty and the dean from that location. And so, the one thing that I would recommend is when you're thinking about it, thinking about really having, like you said, a plan for the logistics of spending the time. Another consideration in our case is we're spread across the state. But as you all know, Delaware is a small state, and so it doesn't take that long to drive from top to bottom. It is doable in a day, but we had to think about what made the most sense for accommodations and access to restaurants or, that sort of thing, like where they could fly into, right? And so for us, that meant probably being in the northern part of our state and flying into Philadelphia. And then planning accordingly so that they could have a touch point at each of the campus locations, which then meant scheduling any additional sites outside of that site team visit timeframe, that Sunday to Wednesday that you talked about. And so the meetings and the schedule, one of the things that I would recommend that we did with the virtual visit, and I think we have this on a slide, Paul, is kind of looking at, you won't know all of the requests until right before, right, of who wants to meet with whom. And so that involves a lot of coordination, but you can make you can estimate, or you can make some guesses as to that they're probably going to want to meet with the student government. They're going to want to meet with faculty. They're going to want to meet with a group of students. So you can start preparing and kind of thinking about how that coordination would look. And a recommendation I might make, even if you shift back to in-person visits, is I think we've all become accustomed to having the access of joining via Zoom or some, sort of blended methodology for a meeting. And so I think the number of people that we have participating, because they could log in from their desk, would force me to consider as an institution, if we don't offer that option, if it's agreeable with the Middle States visitors in the future, to have blended or a variety of both, just because I think we had a great participation. And that's what we heard from our site team visitors as well.
So Lisa, you addressed part of that third question. How did you facilitate the various meetings? Some of them you predicted, but did y'all also leave a little flexible time so that any last minute request could be accommodated?
Yes, because you could schedule a full schedule, and the team will say, well, we've met with this group and now we want to meet with a different group of faculty, right? We heard from your, X department, and now we want a variety, or we want a different group of students. And so we tried to leave those spaces and also time to process the information and for discussion. So one of the things that's important to consider is when you get all of those requests and they're coming in, is how to best capitalize on the time. So if you think the representative from Standard 1 wants to understand the mission, but the person that's looking at budget and resources also wants to understand how you're fulfilling your mission with, good use of those, it might make sense for them both to meet with the Student Government Association and see how they're how they put in budget requests and what they have as far as resources at the same time to get those questions answered. So to me, that means, a spreadsheet with kind of the lay of the land and all the requests, and then seeing how you can condense those into the most productive schedule so that you allow the team members to process the information. And really, I think it generates a better format for questioning when there's more than one visitor able to play off of one another's questions with those groups, honestly.
So all of our teams have private meeting time where they say, okay, well, I found this and this is what we're thinking. And so did you facilitate that, or did the chair facilitate those, just the team meetings?
Yeah, so we had a schedule with the Zoom links by the day, and then we had a private Zoom room, if you will, for them to meet, where they were the only ones admitted. And so each visitor was assigned an IT support, and then we had an overall IT support kind of lead that served as the concierge, moving people in and out of rooms as needed and making sure everyone had the right Zoom link and everyone was where they were supposed to be. And so that person sort of served as no one else was allowed access to that room, right? It was just for them to discuss, and it was open for the full time.
Okay, that's good. That's good. As we transition back to face-to-face visits, we've become very efficient about going from one Zoom meeting to another. But if I'm going from one meeting from one end of your campus to another, make sure that you're providing guides, that you have a map, that you're doing those types of things. So, Javier, how did y'all do the private team meetings? Did you set them up kind of like Lisa did?
Well, my first comment in this is that the schedule for me is always a draft. And let me explain why. Every afternoon, I have a meeting with the evaluation team chair. And if they want to make some changes to the schedule, we made it in that moment. So every afternoon, we review the whole schedule with the chair. Also, I think that one of the main things that as a liaison and as a maybe, being the person in charge of the whole process, is that you have to be flexible with the team, okay? And that's very important because things change, and maybe they have scheduled a meeting with the director of admission, and they told me, well, I don't need this meeting. I have enough information, so I would like to change this meeting and have the meeting with the register, for example. So you need to be flexible. In our case, all the private meetings that the team has was organized by the chair, okay? And also, what we did to facilitate, all those members' requests was, at the beginning when we have the meetings every afternoon. So we have some new meetings, we add, the meeting, and we change the schedule, because in our schedule, what we have made that help us a lot is that in the last column, we add the link, the Zoom link, to the meeting. So that helps us, a lot. So every night, all the team members, and also my institution, and all the persons that are going to work with me in the process, receive a new schedule with all the links, working, and everything was, done. And for us, I have to be honest, our best representation is our students, okay? So yes, we have students in all in our meetings, but also we have special meetings only with students. And what we have done is that before the visit, we have a meeting with all our student council, with all our student associations, with all our student athletes, and we explained to them what Middle State was expecting from them, and that for us is very important their participation. So I think that it was a key element that the students have an excellent participation in the whole process.
Yeah. And I think that's true regardless of the type of institution you are, because your students really reflect the culture of the institution. So Amy, how did y'all organize your meetings between private meetings with just the team, and then also the meetings with various constituents from the college?
I think our biggest thing was having 1 or 2 administrative assistants who would let people, ours was virtual. So having 1 or 2 administrative assistants who let people into the room to make sure that he or she had a checklist of who was to be in, and then she could allow them into the room. And then making sure, the other big thing, and this was not one of the surprises, but trying to put it together, how much the schedule had to match, making sure that so-and-so, the president, didn't need to be at this meeting, but also at this meeting, even though he wasn't on the standing committee or steering committee, that he be at both meetings. So laying out the schedule so you can not literally be 2 places at one time.
So one thing to think about is you don't want herd mentality. So you're divide and conquer, find out what meetings that the different team members are wanting to have. And instead of letting them go in mass, divide and conquer, and then they can come back and get some work done. And
the other thing there too, especially, is making sure who on the visiting team wants to see who, because they would offer, I remember that too, is the visiting team would reach out and say, we really want to see. And that's one thing that we worked with our vice president and said, is there anyone in particular? And then he asked, and we asked our liaison, our leader of the visiting team, and he or she would say, we would like to see. So making sure that if she said, I want to see so-and-so, that they weren't in different rooms at different times or something virtually.
Okay. Well, thank you all. Those are some great suggestions, some great ideas. If we happen to go back to virtual visits, there are some really good resources on the Middle States website. And I'm not going to spend some time because we are truly looking forward to having getting back to face-to-face. So this is something that you can review at your leisure. So I wanted to come back to Lisa because she did give us a sample schedule, from, and I apologize, Lisa, for making it so small, but
That's okay. So generally, you can see across the top are the standards, and I will say I changed it to the standard to remove the names of the assigned chairs for each standard, but we did have the names because we felt like it's useful for anyone that's using this schedule to know as a refresher who they're meeting with, right, to address them by name. And then the other thing that I did on here, to Amy's point, was the president's schedule was actually highlighted in a different color so that he could kind of see across the expectations for where he needed to be, because sometimes it was jumping from place to place, honestly. But you can see where we tried, maybe you can see it is small, but we tried to merge some of those opportunities to meet. So this is the schedule by day. And then at the bottom, there are tabs, and I did not list all of these, but the additional tabs are the attendees. And so if we knew the attendees in advance, we had the names, titles, etc. spelled out, and just a way to check attendance, like the board of trustees, of course, right? We had those, we had the representatives listed. And so it was a good point of reference for the visitors, but it also allowed the IT folks to know who should be allowed into which meetings, to help manage that, to Amy's point, just because you want to try to be as efficient as possible with your Zoom meetings and the time that they get with each.
this is where the on the Wednesday morning, the team chair will meet with your president, have to, again, never surprise a president, to let he or she know what's going to be there. And their critical findings are going to be in this report. Right? It does not propose the team's proposal for commission action because they are only making a recommendation. Right? Only the commission can take action for our member institutions. So please don't make any public statements with this team evaluation. This should be private to the, you can have as many people from your campus that you want there, but it should not be transmitted. It should not have any press coverage. And once the report is complete, questions and comments are not appropriate. So the team chair will say, we'll go through the 7 standards and say, this is what we found. These are the recommendations. This is what we're going to be passing on. But then they're going to thank you very much for your hospitality, and they leave. No questions, no, you might wave at them on the way out, but that's it. So after the visit, reporting deadlines, the commission notifies the chair, and the chair will get a draft team report to your president. And this is to check for factual errors. Right? Then the institution returns it to the team chair, who uploads it in the portal. And at that point, the institution is going to respond to the institutional response. Please involve. Don't rely just on your president to write this or the president's cabinet, but the people who've been intimately involved with this whole process are the steering committee and the co-chairs. They can help craft that. And then after the team response is in, the chair will craft a confidential brief. The team report, the self-study report, the institutional response in the draft are what goes to the Committee on Evaluation Reports. Again, please think about the institutional response and really think about how you want to respond. If you disagree with what the team is saying, you can say that, but it must be uploaded to the institutional portal. It comes in the form of a letter on the institution's letterhead and should be submitted by the CEO on within 7 calendar days of the team report. Typically, I have seen an institutional response that was 3 sentences. We thank the team for coming. We agree with their findings. We look forward to the commission action. But others can be a little more detailed. Right? So let's talk about what those responses may be. If the team report says that the institution is in compliance, then you acknowledge the work, you agree with it, and you move on. If they have Just a sec, let me find my correct button here. If the institution is found in compliance, but with some recommendations that include the team's recommendations. And if you agree with them, acknowledge that. If you disagree, provide specific information, not assertions, not plans for the future, but explicit information. And you may point to a different interpretation of evidence. So if the team or if the institution is found to be in non-compliance, acknowledge their work. If you agree with the requirement, say, yep, we missed the mark here. If you disagree, again, be explicit in your response. So let's come back to our co-facilitators again. And what surprised you about this visit? I know, Lisa, you said that this is the first time you've been really heavily involved. So what kind of took you off guard?
So when you wrap up that process and you submit the self-study, I think that's the first layer of celebration, right? Like submit, exhale, and then come the requests just short of your visit, right? So everyone's read it, and I was surprised at the number of additional pieces of documentation that we were requested to provide to the site team just prior to and during the visit. And maybe that was, you know, me overestimating, thinking we'd done a really thorough job with our self-study, which I think we did. We had a successful visit, but I think that that was surprising to me. And I will say that I would put a plan in place to manage that if you haven't considered it. So you can imagine that you have each of your different site team visitors meeting with any number of faculty, students, student athlete groups, SGA, student faculty governance, right? And so if they say, tell me about how you do this, and somebody as an afterthought to that meeting decides they're going to send proof or additional evidence, right, to help out that team member to support what they said in the meeting, I would funnel all of that information through a central source and have a plan for that. So, you know, our chair had kind of directed all of those groups, anybody that's meeting with the team, if they ask you for something or you promise something in a meeting and say, oh, I have a good example, I can email it to you afterwards, that it should really be coming from the chair on your side, right? And really coordinated through a single point of contact rather than just being sent haphazardly, so that you can ensure it's the documentation and the evidence that the institution wants to put forward.
Yeah, Lisa, that's a great point. You want to have some central coordination, because if the team actually, and some of the stuff they're going to say, oh, that doesn't really tell me what I'm looking for. But if they find something that's really useful, then you're going to have to upload that as additional evidence.
Yes.
And you're going to have to provide the team chair a list of the additional evidence that was uploaded to the portal. Because remember, you want the team to have the same information, the Committee on Evaluation Reports to have the same information, and the commission to have the same information.
Exactly. So that inventory is critical. So at the end of each day, we had to, you know, kind of comb all of those requests and make sure we had captured everything. So it's important that your internal constituents know that they have a single point of contact for anything that they plan to provide or would like to provide. And it's one vetted, right, through the self-study steering committee, and then also something that's uploaded appropriately.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. So Amy, what about you? Anything come as a, so you've been at Like Coming for a good while. You've been involved in this. Did anything kind of catch you off guard?
So I think the biggest thing that it wasn't even caught off guard, it was more of an appreciation. I think watching all of the other, like the constituents across campus, like see what the administration does, see what staff does. I think it brings together, as much as people are like, it's your self-study. I think if you embrace it, and I think if you use it as a positive instead of, oh no, another assessment, we need to check a box on assessment, use it as, look what you can learn about what's going on in residence life. Look what you can learn from the faculty perspective, having different people's work together. I think you have to just celebrate that culture of assessment and how we each drive each other with it. So that would be my first like surprise, like, oh my gosh, they actually just people surprising and liking that they learned that much about each other. And something Lisa said, and I was like, oh, I need to say that too, because it was so true about, and of course it slipped my mind, but what it was something else about like something she said, I was like, yes, that's exactly right. That surprise was there. And I think now I remember it was like having that one person, like when they say like, we'll need this and this, just being ready to know that they could ask for more stuff. And that's not a bad thing, because you weren't a dumping ground. That's actually positive. Like you're telling your story, your qualitative is telling the story, add the additional information that you need to bring to it. But that's only going to help you solidify what you've already said. So back to her point, you know, to have that one person, two people that have that time. And someone in the questions had asked, like, it's a small school. I hear you about being a small school. You wear many, many hats at a small school. And sometimes a request or an invitation from a president or a provost really helps than coming from Amy in assessment or something. So can you serve on this committee? I mean, if you're really like to try to get more people involved, having your president, your provost, your, vice president, whoever may be, send those. I really would like to see you in this position email.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Amy.
you're welcome.
Javier.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say,
No.
I just had one last thought that I didn't realize. Amy mentioned something that triggered this for me. The collegial aspect that you spoke to. Sometimes if you have real, the focus of pushing the culture of assessment forward is certainly present. But the collegial aspect of if you have something innovative going on, that will pique curiosity naturally among folks that are visiting, particularly if it's something that they're looking to institute or they're on the cusp of implementing at their campus. And so, that was something that we might have had more requests about. We are a community college with a bachelor's degree program, a second bachelor's degree that just launched, which is unusual. So we may get more requests about something like that because it's less familiar and it's innovative, right? So those sorts of things, I think that was a nice surprise because I can see how the information is spreading that way. In a good way.
Sure. So Javier, any last surprise that you encountered?
Well, I just was listening to Lisa, and I was completely agree with her about the additional information that the evaluation team requests. For example, I have 113 additional documents, and I know the number because I was the one in charge of upload all that information. I have control of all the information, additional information that I have to send to the evaluation team. And it was very important because I sent the information by email to the chair every day. And also I upload the information in the Middle State portal because it was very important, that you don't miss any document in the portal. But I would like to mention that for us, this process, this last self-study was really a challenge to us. Why? Because we begin the process after Hurricane Maria, okay? And as you know, Hurricane Maria basically have a very strong impact in the island. So the hurricane hit us in September, and we begin the process in October. So it was a really challenge to us to begin, this process that is a very complex process and require a lot of people, working in the process. So for us, maybe, that little, piece of what happened to us in the process of Middle States help us to get, together more, get us more together in the institution. I don't know if you understand, but
I do.
We get very close, and everybody was, engaged to work with Middle State and to present our best, performance, because for us it was, really hard, and it was an example of resiliency for the middle state and for our colleagues in other institutions. So, this process, was hard, but it was really great for us.
Well, kudos to all three of your institutions. You came through with flying colors. Just a couple slides here remind you of the policies and procedures that are relevant to what you are going through. And just remember that you have resources on the Middle States portal. Questions, but we're moving back to a face-to-face conference this year on December 7th through the 9th at the Downtown Marriott in Philadelphia. And we've got a great agenda. And so hope that many of you will be able to join us there for what we think is going to be a really nice conference. So registration is open. So you can go to the Middle States website and you get a little pop-up that gives you an opportunity to register right away. Thank you for staying with us today. We had a great turnout. At one point, over 350 people. And again, to Amy, Lisa, and Javier, thank you for your contribution.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it. Take care.